So good afternoon for everyone that has joined us so far. We'll just leave it for a minute or so just to let everyone join, and then we will begin. Hi, Deborah. Thank you for joining us today. We'll just leave it a minute or so, just wait for a few more people to join, and then we will begin. It's always the longest minute. Trying to be quiet as well. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for another GPA webinar. And it's exciting today because we have 4 great speakers that will be discussing mergers and acquisitions, enabling HR and payroll to close the deal. So your facilitator today is Catherine, so I'm going to pass this over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melanie, and thank you everyone for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine Honey. I am with Safeguard Global, joining you from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm the VP of Strategic Partner Relations here at Safeguard, and I'll really just be acting as your facilitator and your moderator for today's session. But really thrilled to be joined by 3 great panelists today, and thank you all for joining us. First, we have Tracy Micciche. For nearly 20 years, Tracy has helped companies achieve world-class performance in global systems for payroll, mobility, travel expense, and human resources. Her experience includes leading global transformations through the creation of value of end state visions, evaluation of sourcing strategies, redesigning operating processes, evaluating software products, and managing large-scale global implementation projects. Certified payroll practitioner, Tracy's specialties also include expatriate management. She's a frequent lecturer on the topic of global payroll solutions and is an associate principal at the Hackett Group. So thank you for joining us, Tracy. We're also joined today by Danielle White. Danielle is Collaborative Solutions VP of Global Customer Engagement. She brings over 20 years of HR transformation experience across commercial and public sector industries to this role. And her prior roles across the delivery and strategy practices at Collaborative enable her to support customers by ensuring thought leadership, delivery, and account support are founded in the challenges facing customers today. Danielle's M&A experience spans leading Workday integration activities, as well as having been through acquisitions as the acquired and the acquirer. And last but certainly not least, we're joined today by Neil Carpenter, who's the EVP of Strategic Alliances and Channels at Safeguard Global. He brings 18 years experience in global payroll and employer of record services to his role. And he has been one of the founding members of Safeguard Global and has held multiple roles within the business, from general manager of EMEA to SVP of payroll globally to leading the sales organization. He's passionate about this industry, combining commercial and operational experience, and has been key in helping organizations reach their goals as they go through change and transformation. So together, these 3 panelists will lead our discussion around mergers and acquisitions, enabling HR and payroll to close the deal. So with that, I will turn it over to Tracy to get us started.
All right, can we advance the slides too? So my experience, I have done this from both your side of the fence. I've done it as a consultant, working through. And there's a lot of different components that you have to think about. And I think we start to think about just kind of like, okay, what provider am I going to use, or what technology am I going to use? But it's a heck of a lot more complicated when we're doing this, trying to merge 2 companies together. Or I've also kind of thrown in there some spin-offs. So that's also, we're trying to create a company off of another one. So they're all kind of integrated. But I think one of the things is like looking at the service design. So as you're trying to bring companies together or create a whole new company off itself, you're going to really need to think about how you're going to service your customers, which would be your employees. So what are we going to be looking at? How are we going to answer questions? What is the knowledge base going to look like? Are we going to have a knowledge base? How much self-service are we going to have? Are we going to use case management tools? Are we going to utilize, the acquiring company? Are we going, so all of that stuff, all those questions kind of have to be answered as we're going through, as we start to do the design. Service partnering. is also huge in this, because not only you're going to have to, payroll has to, go through and partner with accounting, they have to partner with HR in order to get the things done. Now you're talking about partnering with another company. So you have to really sharpen your skills and work through all of that and figure out how you're going to work together. And you have to think about how you're going to work together pre-merger and post-merger. So there may be some things that we can do, and we'll talk about this on the next slide, what can be done pre-merger versus post-merger, but really thinking about how the organization is going to come together and how you're going to combine the two organizations is going to be really important. Then as you're going through thinking about the human capital, what do we need to do? From what types of skills are we going to need? What are the types of, as a combined organization, are we going to, how many people are we going to need? Is there overlap? What are we going to do with those people if there is overlap? So thinking through all of that. The organization and governance is also not only during the project, as you're going through the project, but also through the, throughout how you're going to, as a retained organization, how are you going to govern and changes? How are you going to measure yourselves? All those types of things have to be thought of. And then of course, technology is enabling, and it is underpinning of all the things that you want to do. Where is there duplication? Where are you going to be merging? Are you going to be just the technology strategy is going to go towards the acquiring company? Or are you going to do an evaluation and figure out which technology is best and keep which? So all of those kinds of strategies have to be thought of, and you can start to define that pre-merger and then refine it as you go from a post-merger. One of the things that we, from a best practice perspective, we like to see companies create a playbook, especially if you're doing this on a regular basis. This is something that a lot of companies have, a lot of I would have to say that recently I have been going through working with a lot of companies that have grown through mergers and acquisitions. They haven't had a playbook, and what they've ended up with is a very complex, very spaghetti-like environment. From my perspective, what we've been trying to do with them is go through all the evaluations, maybe some of these things that I spoke about or on this slide and on the previous slide. They didn't really do that. They just kind of took a lift and shift approach. And so it's been very complicated for them as they've grown globally, to be able to kind of reset. And they are now looking at some of the digital, and they want to embrace some of these things, but what they're finding is there's just too many variations, too many things. So having a playbook about how you're going to go about mergers and acquisitions, how you're going to combine the companies is going to be critical from that perspective as you go through this. If you only do one every 10 years, maybe not so much, but if this is something that you're going to be regularly doing, I highly, highly recommend it. So kind of the things that usually you can share pre-close is like kind of the systems, the technologies that you're using, maybe some high level headcount, different areas, kind of thinking about identifying who on both sides might be working on the project. We went through and did this. You might not be able to talk too much, especially during the quiet period, but at least this gives you some idea about how you can start the planning and get some kind of ideas on what systems they have, that kind of thing, and look at, is there some opportunity, to combine some of these, or is there some opportunity, start putting together the governance structure, start talking about like how we're, from a change management perspective, if we're going to be, there's usually some folks who don't make the cut as you combine the resources. So, how are you going to handle severance? What about people that you want to retain, at least through the merger activities? May not have a future role, are you going to offer stay bonuses? So those are the kinds of things that you want to look at. If it happens to be a spinoff where you're actually creating a new company, there's a couple of uniqueness about that. One, as you're going to have to set up all of the governance structures, you're going to have to set up all of the banking, and you got to really know kind of some of the things that we have struggled with some of these that I've done with clients, is we don't even know who the officer is when they created the company for that particular country or entity. And so, retaining keeping track of who has signing authority in that particular legal entity is going to be critical, because it's going to make a difference as you start to kind of trying to set up payroll entities and from a legal perspective, things like that. So the next part is after post-close. TSA is a transition services agreement. So if there's a period of time, especially if you're buying a portion of another company, or maybe agreement that's put in as part that they have to have certain things for a certain period of time. So really understanding what's included in that TSA agreement. Things that are typically in there would be, might be some salary protection for a period of time. There may be some level of benefits for a period of time for employees. It could have, like, they're going to continue to operate under the previous company for, say a year or 2 years, depending on what that, whatever has been agreed upon. So you may have time. Others don't have a TSA agreement, and on day one, you have to take over processing. That's a little bit more challenging, but so just kind of make sure you understand what that is. Looking at contract terms and conditions. So as you're trying to merge some of these things together, so thinking about what you might need from a contracting perspective. What are they, because as you start to kind of put things in, in the timing, and you start to do the timeline, when are you going to move them? Some of them may have buyouts where you can just buy out the contracts for, a nominal sum. Some don't have, some of the contracts may be, month to month, so it doesn't matter. But thinking about that and understanding what the additional costs may be if you have to buy out a contract, if you're ending a contract early, is going to be critical from a financial perspective. So I think a couple other things, I'm not going to go through all of them, but understanding kind of the assumptions pre-merger, make adjustments for that, make sure you get the team onboarded, they start working together, maybe have some kind of, we've done some kind of activities to to break the ice, and maybe when we have travel again, having things like an icebreaker or some kind of where everyone can kind of come together and meet each other is really helpful. Let's go on the next slide. And go to the next one. So some of the things that we learned along the way, and this has come from my personal experience, a lot of this, the playbook is really critical, like I talked about in the previous slide, having a formal process to track and capture benefits of each acquisition. So understanding kind of what's changing. And this is a very chaotic environment. People are working like all kinds of crazy hours. So the more that you can have all this stuff done pre-merger, even if you can't share the information, the better, because then you can take the two organizations, put them together and say, okay, this is what's staying the same. This is what's different. How's it going to change? Otherwise, you are going to be always running behind. So try to be proactive rather than reactive. Budgets. So the budgets for the merger often change widely as you go through the process. There are certain assumptions that were made in order to create the budgets. So understanding what those are, and then where you have variances and where you may have some surprises, make sure you call that out early so that the finance team understands what those are. And you can explain where some of the assumptions may have gone wrong. And I think change management, understanding this is a very turmoil time, and understanding how people are going to react. Everyone's going to react a little bit differently. So it's really important to understand that this is very emotional, and put the right change resources. Don't skimp on that. Next slide.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Tracy. We're going to take a moment and launch our first poll question, if you would, Melanie. The question is around, is standardization or harmonization a part of your strategy for M&A activity? Everyone can take a second and just answer that, either yes, no, or unsure. Perhaps you're not sure of your plans just yet. And we will give a minute or two for people to respond into that. And then Tracy, I'm sure you'll continue your comments and talk a little bit about that and what people are seeing around that area. And Melanie, we're starting to see some results come in.
Yes, we are. So, guys, those of you that normally attend our webinars, you know, I've got like a figure that I like to get in to get a good idea of what you guys are thinking. So we just need a few more people to answer the poll, if possible. So, what do you guys think the answer is going to be on this one? Tracy, have you?
From my experience, I would say probably no or unsure.
Okay. Okay. So we're nearly there. Just a couple more people. And then Catherine, if you're okay, we'll end the poll.
For sure.
Okay.
I would tend to agree with you, Tracy. It's I think a lot of folks are kind of unsure as they go into this, particularly if it's their first one or two in the M&A or divestiture space, not really sure what that's really going to look like and things. So to your point around bringing some of that the playbook experience into play as part of the process makes a lot of sense here.
And I think the other thing too, from this perspective, is that a lot of times people will not, do the harmonization standardization because it elongates the process. However, it's, short-term gain for long-term pain. So you end up with what you're left with is a real mess and trying to recover operationally. So you may get it live, but then trying to work through all the complexities of two basically parallel organizations is really painful.
Okay, so I've ended the poll. Do you want me to share the results for you?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Okay. Can you see that?
Oh, I was wrong. 68% said yes. So maybe I only get the ones that don't do it, and they're in a lot of. So we said there's a 68% is said yes, 24% said unsure, and only 7% said no. So these are just a couple of things from standardization perspective. When we do all of our benchmarking and all of our advisory programs, we look at all of these things. And so one of the things that I just want to drive home is that from a world-class top performer perspective, 65% have high level of standardization. And from source data being high quality, 71%. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind as you're going through this. This is something that is does actually have an impact to your bottom line. Let's go to the next slide. So kind of one of the things from a standardization simplification process, these are just I'm just going to go through the highlights here. I'm not going to go through everything. But you'll have a chance to read the slides later. But, the blueprint documentation process, I would focus on the future state. Some of those things is you can spend a lot of time like overly documenting the current state. If that's not going to be where you're going to be, just focus on what do you want for a future state perspective. Measurements of process adherence. So making sure that when you set up your organizational structure, you've got KPIs and SLAs that are actually measuring some of these things to make sure that they are that we have a governance structure in place so as you go through this process that it stays, because once you've created it, then people start to go rogue if you don't have the right structure. But we don't want to be overly bureaucratic either. So we want to make sure that it actually has enough, it's not too complicated. It's flexible enough to meet the demands of the business and of change. Knowledge management is part of the digital organization. There's just some really cool tools out there nowadays, or you can even do a Google search. How do I change my direct deposit? And you don't have to go through trying to figure out where someone put it on the SharePoint. So some of those things should be looked at as we go from a global perspective. And then process ownership, really making sure we have someone that owns the process from an end-to-end perspective. We really want to enforce the global process owners. So on the bottom part here, we've got some making sure you understand like who's doing what in the process, building continuous improvement, business relationship management, understanding the voice of the customer, as well as the service partnering going across each of the ends. And then as you design this, have an idea from a customer perspective. So design with the end in mind. So look at how it's going to impact the employees. Here's just a couple of things. So during the virtual, this is the virtual working transition. So obviously this is going to have an impact on the payroll process, especially as people are even, leaving the country. Making sure you have the right policies in place to limit them at least without having, having some sort of approval process if they're going outside where you're currently doing business. We've got people that I've had people that are like actually, moved to like Costa Rica or some beautiful island. But if you're not doing business there, you could run into a real tax problem. So just kind of think about that. Also from a merger perspective, are there any new entities, anything that you may be coming across? And, how are you going, if they have a highly virtual culture, how are you going to incorporate that in with your current company culture? All right, let's go to the next slide. There's just some other kind of key facts. Data related technologies, so just kind of thinking about it. This is pre and post crisis. So as you're looking at some of the things that you're using today, kind of think about that from a merger and acquisition perspective. What kind of technologies are you going to keep? What things are you going to need? Or is there something that they have that's kind of cool that you don't have today? So think about that in the back of your mind as you're going through this process. And then what types of emerging technologies? Maybe there's some budget to actually implement some of these things as a part of that. Go to the next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Danielle, and she's going to talk a little bit more in detail about the technology piece.
Thanks, Tracy. So I think we have our next poll question, right, Kathy?
We do. Melanie, if you could tease up our next poll question for us, we'd appreciate that. This is as we transition into the next section, excuse me. What keeps you up at night when thinking about your mergers and acquisitions besides the whole thing? But what are you really particularly focused on? Is it really around integrating processes, policies, and technologies? Is it around a change in company culture? What about the impacts to roles or structures? And then, of course, change management? Or is it something else entirely? Danielle, what do you typically see with your clients?
I will say that actually it probably is a mix of the top two. Obviously, depending on how large the organizations are and how global their reach might have been pre or post acquisition, there can be a lot of complications around processes and policies. So we see a lot of focus on that. But I think, ultimately, depending on what the outcome of the activity is, there's always a concern about how the two cultures are going to align. Awesome.
We deliberately left off a choice F, all the above, right? Oh, it's interesting. There are always some very complicated situations and scenarios, and obviously whether it's a merger, an acquisition, or a divestiture, there's some different feelings and impacts across all the processes. So I'll be curious to see what people are thinking about this.
Would you like me to end the poll? Should we end the poll in 10 seconds? So if everyone can, those of you that haven't voted, if you could just vote now, that'd be fantastic.
Perfect.
Are you happy for me to close it, Catherine?
Perfect timing, yep. Thank you.
There we go, integrating process, policies, and technologies. We actually used this poll recently on another webinar, and it's consistent. Like I said, I think that's probably the number one challenge that we're seeing is everybody think about the devil's in the details of what you need to actually get through to make the acquisition or even the divestiture spinoff successful. So doesn't surprise me to see that.
I'll stop sharing now. Is that okay?
Thank you. So to kind of tie back into what Tracy was talking about, obviously, there's a lot of reasons why you might undergo a merger, an acquisition, or even a spinoff. And all of that, the why influences your how. And you might say, how is that influencing it? And it can be everything from, if you're going into a new market, maybe you have new types of employees that you need to hire. You're looking at new job architectures, new roles, new skills, new competencies that you need to think about. If it's a new market and those employees are paid vastly different than your existing set, then you might be looking at a new compensation architecture. So all of those things come together to really, help influence what you're trying to achieve. If we're talking about really, expanding presence, you might have a much more aligned situation where you're just really acquiring employees who already do similar work to what you do today. And so that might be more of a data acquisition. I think that, when Workday looks at really, how they've been able to enable speed to close from an HR technology perspective, it depends on what kind of acquisition we're talking about. If we're talking about just bringing on additional employees for you to expand in your existing markets, both from a product and geography perspective, then a lot of times those can be, managed via mass hires or other processes within a system. And we have some customers that have actually been able to reduce their time for acquisition from months to actually weeks and days. So all of this influences, obviously expanding into a new geography. This is really when we start talking about those, things that keep people up at night when we think about your processes and your policies and your technology. And that geography could be new states in the US, and thinking about the new tax laws that you need to think about from a payroll perspective, to geographies thinking about expanding into new regions of the world and the changes or differences in data privacy requirements. And I think also from, expanding your presence in existing verticals, again, looking at what the skills are that are needed for you to accomplish that, and whether or not changes need to be made to your acquired entities or associates to make that happen. As Tracy mentioned, time to close, though, is typically not something that the people who are responsible for executing the technology strategy are privy to. So everything from, what are we looking at from our timeline? And what are our objectives coming out of that timeline? What are we trying to achieve? How much are we trying to be aligned? Is there standardization and harmonization present? As I saw that poll result at 68%, I'll say, from a Workday perspective, we see a lot of our clients actually trying to achieve standardization and harmonization. And that may be just, a function of, the cloud product itself. It's a little bit easier for a lot of our customers to do that. But looking at your timeline and what you're trying to achieve will drive a lot of your approaches. So when we think about your sourcing your target, are you coming off of two of the exact same systems? Maybe both the existing acquired company and the acquiring company are both Workday customers already. Maybe, one is Workday and one is PeopleSoft or, SAP. Maybe, as part of the acquisition, I have actually seen people be very bold and as part of the merger say, okay, we're merging and we want to go with Workday at the same time. So there's a lot of different options when you're looking at your source data and your target and how you're going to be extracting that data and getting it into the right environment. Now, I will say that obviously that then drives us to data and processes. So as we think about data and processes, again, is it going to be harmonized or aligned? Are you looking at taking advantage of changes? Is your timeline enough that it's going to give you an opportunity to actually go through standardization throughout the process? Or do you need to put a roadmap together that actually allows you to have optimization as part of it? Protect and provide is really thinking about, how are you going to give everyone access to the systems? What are they going to have the ability to see? How are they going to get in there? What are the security rules, access provisioning? All that's going to drive further conversations on the later slides as we think about what are those specific technologies that you need to consider and how they all relate to your core HR and payroll systems. And then finally, the ever-present employee experience. I think, as we've seen over the last year, gone are the days for employee experience to not be a focus point. We're really taking a direct view of, how we make sure that our associates have the most positive experience, when they're going through these activities. And that needs to be kind of front and center when you're thinking about your design going forward from a systems perspective. Next slide, Kathy. But when we think about those key considerations for systems integrations, I'll tell you that the number one thing that we see from most of our clients is actually that reporting and analytics needs. I think, a lot of clients are actually trying to get to that consolidated reporting, trying to see where, there might be overlapping roles, where there might be, some gaps in compensation from an equity perspective, understanding, what groups are doing what work in a very consolidated manner. So that's really a starting point for many organizations as they think about how they want to approach their systems integration, is how quickly can they get to that consolidated reporting and analytics. Security is a key consideration here. Again, as I mentioned on the previous slide, and we're thinking about security, how do you enable timely access to the information that people need? And how is that following your best practices that you've already been operating under? And how do you look at the security protocols across both organizations or the multiple organizations? Sometimes what we see is actually a multiple merger or a merger and divestiture at the same time, where we see two organizations joining, they form a third organization as a part of it, and that third one becomes a spinoff. All of that's going to impact the security that you choose to apply to the entire process. Ease of integration is thinking about how many systems are you actually integrating to? What are your downstream systems? Are there common systems between the organizations? Maybe you have the same benefits providers, even if you don't have the same plans. Maybe you have, the same payroll providers, even if you don't have the same, details on the payroll as how it's being managed. So looking at that ease of integration, looking at, what kind of commonalities you may or may not have across your middleware options, whether that middleware layer is a data warehouse or a data lake, how are you managing the information that's going to need to be consumed by multiple systems? Do you have any, tools that can help make that ease of integration a little bit easier, something along the lines of an API management tool? So all of those things taken into consideration across your organizations will really drive it. Again, employee experience, we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail, but here we're really thinking about the digital employee experience. And this all goes back to that security and how they're going to have access and what that access is going to look like. Also related to process efficiencies, from a back office perspective, we might be looking at process efficiencies specifically for our HR and payroll teams, but we also need to think about, are those processes as efficient and effective as possible for the employees to have a positive experience with them? From a data availability, there's nothing that's going to impact trust of a system more than knowing whether or not your data is accurate and available to employees when they need them. So I think this is always a key consideration when you're looking at integrating your systems. Take the opportunity to do any cleanup necessary to make sure you understand what data you have available, where the source of it is, what can actually be changed, and then communicate to it. We've actually had, organizations that have merged where we find out from one that might be in PeopleSoft, one that's in Workday, that data fields that exist in Workday didn't exist in PeopleSoft in the acquired organization. And so what they chose to do, as far as how they handled maybe dates, effective dates for when people moved into position or into roles, they needed to make a decision on that line in the sand, but you then need to communicate that to your employees so they understand why a date might look different when they log into their new system than it would have looked in their old system. Next slide. And it's really, no one group can execute this by themselves, and no one area is focused on itself. I call it a team sport to really get through those, integrations. When we think about the organizational planning for an integration and looking at your requirements, and those are requirements across the business as well as across your technology. What are the resource requirements for you to actually execute upon this? Everybody's still managing their business as usual jobs. Business doesn't stop just because you're going through an integration. So we need to understand what are the requirements from people to help support it, and what are those constraints? And then going through, what are the tools you have available to you to actually help drive all of these? Again, I think this goes back to Tracy's comments about a playbook, and there's not just a one size fits all playbook. We have organizations that we've worked with that have multiple flavors of their mergers and acquisitions. Some of them are incubated, so they're not fully integrated with the organization. Others are fully integrated into existing org structures. And there's a different playbook depending on which approach they're going to take. But all of that's going to include things like requirements discovery, governance and decision-making, current state assessment, and strategic road mapping. I think strategic road mapping is a critical one as we take a look at, you don't need to achieve everything that you want on day one. So what does that look like as a path to get you to success? And then obviously coming out of that is, your outputs. From a teaming perspective, you want to look at your resource across entities. Again, it's a team sport. It's no one size fits all, and it can't all be the acquired company with no input from the acquired or acquiring company and vice versa. So we need to understand who all is going to be involved in both organizations. What third-party partnerships are there going to be? It might be a consulting firm like, Collaborative or the Hackett group that's actually involved with the teaming throughout the integration. The third-party partnerships are also going to be your vendors. So again, your payroll vendors, your benefits vendors, if you have any comp benchmarking vendors, all of that will be, people that you need to understand and bring involved into that process throughout your integration. And making sure that we're taking a very cross-functional approach. Payroll is always the perfect cross-functional, I think, example. This is one where HR, payroll, and finance need to really be partnering in their decisions that they're making. Because we're involving all these external entities potentially, you really need to take a look at those NDAs, your contracts, and your collaboration tools. And then finally, like I mentioned, alignment, it's cross-functional. So we need to understand that finance plan, that HR plan, the IT plan, and the change management plan. Again, going back to Tracy's point about how critical change management is, it really is the glue that's going to tie all of this together to make sure that everybody understands what the expectations are, so that they have a good experience. The alignment on finance and HR and payroll specifically, I think, is critical, because this is where we're really trying to make sure that, if there is a timeline that we're trying to hit from an HR perspective, that finance has a similar timeline. If they're going to be redesigning a chart of accounts, GLs, cost centers, et cetera, what does their schedule look like, and how does it align with the HR and payroll schedule, so we can make sure that we're leveraging all of the changes consistently throughout. Next slide. So when we think about enterprise management, across all of the systems, again, it's no one size fits everything. And there's a lot of tools that are taken into consideration. Looking at what you're using for your business intelligence across multiple organizations. The harmonization and standardization isn't just limited to, HR and finance and payroll, but also looking at, what are you going to be doing from that consolidated reporting going forward? Obviously from an HR perspective, understanding org structures, job architecture, compensation architecture, your payroll architecture, but also what are you doing for IT security management and access? What are you doing from service management? Do you both have ServiceNow, or is one of you using, ServiceNow and Salesforce? How are you going to manage all of those other systems, and which systems are they going to have access to? As I mentioned before, the key with financial is really making sure that we're paying attention to all of that timeline and cross interdependencies. Document management is a huge consideration, especially as you're, might be going into further countries, different geographies. What are the data retention policies that you already have and that you're inheriting as part of your acquisition? What about your purging and archiving strategies? Understanding how you're going to grant access to documents that may be stored off-site or in other systems. And we go from document to collaboration. This is really understanding all of the systems, from a security perspective. How are we going to collaborate? There's so many collaboration tools these days, and we all are, learning to maneuver across them, whether you're a Microsoft shop or a Google shop, understanding whether you're Teams or you're going to be Zoom or GoToMeeting or WebEx. How do we identify how we're going to share information across the entities? Which drives us to our devices, right? How are we going to make sure that we are understanding and consistently applying policies for bring your own device, or maybe not? Maybe bring your own device isn't a policy at the acquired company, but it was at the acquiring company, and you want to extend that to your new associates. I think automation and AI provides a unique opportunity for you to look at your algorithms that have been used in creating the baselines for your automation and AI. For a time period, it might be best practice to actually make sure that everything's being reviewed by, an actual leader in your data or data analytics, to make sure that, they are being applied consistently and accurately based on the new acquisition. This also is impacted by your geography reach. So as new rules have come out from EMEA, for example, on how to treat automation or artificial intelligence, if you're moving into a new geography where that's a consideration, you'll need to take a look at what your processes and policies are around that. And then finally, how does it integrate with your operations? Whether you're a retail organization and need to worry about your point of sale, whether you're a hospitality organization and you're looking at all your registration, opportunities, or you're in manufacturing and looking at your manufacturing systems, there's got to be a connection point, between all these systems to make sure that you're getting and not losing any access, not losing any capabilities, and able to execute business at hand. Next slide. As I mentioned, none of this is done in silo without thinking about the employee digital experience. Again, accurate data is going to be the beginning intro point of having a trusted environment. Having employees actually appreciate and believe what they have will be the first key to making sure they actually use their new systems. Streamline processes. This is going to be critical, again, to make sure that nothing is seen as onerous, that they understand what is expected of them, and that they understand the outcomes of those processes. Understanding where they sit within the organizational context. Where do they sit in the new organization? Again, whether you're incubated or you're integrated, are you sitting as a net new line of business? And so there was very little change to your structure, or are you actually being integrated into existing business units? All of that context is really going to help drive understanding about that digital adoption. Our employees and our workers expect consumer grade technology. That's just a key component of the digital experience these days. So looking at what is best in class, whether that's moving to a cloud product like Workday for your HR and payroll systems, using other technologies that can help really drive that positive experience. I think the drive to digital adoption, there's digital adoption systems out there. We have a lot of customers who might be looking at something like, AppLearn, that really helps bridge the gap between existing technology and new technology, and gives them that experience so they know what they're getting. That chatbots, the FAQs, kind of like Tracy mentioned, being able to go in and easily Google or act like Google and say, how do I do something, and getting a response immediately, not just saying how to do it, but maybe taking you directly to a deep link that allows you to do it, which all drives ease of use. If it's not easy for them, they're not going to use it. And we know that in order for us to have accurate data going forward, for us to have that positive experience, we've got to make sure that we're getting them with that ease of use. So all of those components really will drive your positive experience with your employees to drive that digital adoption. Next slide. But it's not all in your control, as Tracy mentioned about your transition service agreements, right? Many organizations will choose a transition service agreement because they want that improved employee experience for consistency in changing times. It's also a cost-effective approach to managing services while additional due diligence is performed. So you may see an insourced or an outsourced TSA. It's really based on what was deemed important during the deal architecture, as it were, right? So understanding whether or not you're going to maintain your outsourcing arrangements with payroll, benefits, et cetera, maybe even your IT service management. So understanding how all of that works, and then making a decision as to what you're going to, how long it's going to stay in place and what systems accesses they're going to need. This is really going to be critical. If they are outsourced and still having access to new data, then you're going to need to set them up into your new HR payroll system. If they are from a prior company and it's an insourced TSA, for example, then there's a lot of diligence to talk about how you're going to set them up so that they have access, since they might not be a part of the new organization. So thinking about your security roles, your security profiles, all of the components of really making sure that you have a secure environment and you're still meeting the business needs and employee needs across payroll, benefits. Like I said, IT service management is really going to be critical as you think about how to execute your TSAs and their relationship with your technology. Next slide. And now I'm going to pass it off to Neil.
Thank you. And if we can activate our third and final poll, Melanie, while we bring Neil online. And this question is really around payroll. And what do you see as the biggest challenge payroll faces during M&A or divestiture activity? Is it around timing and the need to move payrolls quickly? Is it a lack of information and involvement? Is it defining what the new organization will look like? Or is it disengaging from the old ways of doing things? And again, we deliberately didn't include E, all of the above. But which of these four give you the biggest challenge or sort of keeps you awake the most as you think about M&A and divestiture activity? So Melanie, if you can keep us apprised as to as the poll responses are coming in. Neil, what's your thought about these? What keeps you up the most at night?
Hey guys, so I would say all the above, but what we see most common from a vendor perspective is timing and need to move payroll quickly. That's generally what we see in our organization. Payroll gets left, unfortunately. So planning is important, and obviously I'll be discussing that shortly.
I'd be curious for you, Neil, and perhaps Danielle and Tracy as well, while waiting for some of the poll responses to come in. Have you ever seen a deal fail or a transaction not close due to payroll issues and payroll not being involved quickly enough?
I haven't seen it fail per se, but I have had it where we were biting our nails in order to get it set up. So trying to get the payroll entity set up was very difficult and challenging. But it went down to the wire. I've had to push off because of some of these things. So move that country down to the lower end of the, out and in a different wave because of it.
Gotcha.
And I think I've seen it not necessarily delay the close per se, but it has definitely delayed the systems integrations component.
Awesome.
Okay, just give it 10 seconds. For those of you that haven't voted, if you can just do that now. And then if you're happy, Catherine, I'll close the poll.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to close it and I'm just going to share the results now. Can you see that okay?
Yes, ma'am. You were right, Neil. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. So as we've seen, there's many unique challenges or opportunities facing companies in the midst of M&A and divestiture activity. Payroll has some very specific challenges to address. Things like merging employees and payrolls, compliance, during and after the deal, technology, service delivery integration, banking, and entity relationships. But above all that detail, there are three really main areas that we'd like to cover, and that's timing, as I just mentioned there. We're often brought to the table late, and we usually don't have the time in the world. TSAs may place limitations on timing, or even there's long ones in place. Often a desire to get off the TSA sooner rather than later is generally what we see. And support. There may no longer be a team. You may need to stand up a new function, or even the existing team that you have may not even be aware of what's going on, or may not be allowed to be aware of what's going on. So you feel a little bit on an island alone. And then from a change management, lots of things will be different. So, we've mentioned, Tracy and Danielle have obviously discussed some of that, from corp brand, culture, operating models, and technology. Maybe I can give you an example, but one of our recent customers that was merging some companies, they did not think about payroll. The focus was primarily on HCM. And this became very challenging for both the merging company and ourselves as the vendor. They were on a TSA, but unfortunately the TSA had a 12-month end date. And when we were brought to the table, it only gave us 5 months, obviously, which created some implications. So timing is really everything. When you were talking about a project of moving maybe 2,000 employees in multiple locations, there really isn't enough time. It puts a lot of pressure on yourselves, your team, and creates a lot of risk for all parties involved. So it needs to be organized, planned carefully. Otherwise, you're ending up with more risk, complexity, and of course, we talked about it, sleepless nights, and we don't like that in payroll, that's for sure. Next slide, please. So what can or should we do to prepare for M&A activity and to respond to it in the most effective manner possible? First, agility and flexibility are key. Whether you're managing the activity yourself or most likely with your partner, you need to develop a plan and a pathway for success. So, when we talk about transition planning, technology, solution, Danielle's just been talking about that. What does the delivery model look like? In-source, lift and shift, outsource, new vendors, existing vendors, timelines, contracts, etc. Then you look at the resource management. Who is the team and what gaps do you have? Who has the knowledge? Do you have budget for additional support? Because you may need it. And is that part of the TSA? So agility, flexibility when it comes to resource are key here. And then when we talk about a global payroll strategy, we saw the data a moment ago around harmonization, being a key component. Absolutely. I think that's the end goal for everyone. But sometimes in these M&A activities or divestitures, sometimes it's just really important just to stand up the payroll to ensure people are paid. So, you really need to be thinking about that end state. What does that operating model look like? And what, do you have a clear goal? And what does the path look like to get there? So some points to really consider. Advocate for inclusion in conversations ASAP. Illustrate the reasons why and payroll's ability to maintain confidence. Establish a plan for mitigating operations into a new environment. What do you need? Do you have entities in place? Tracy made a good point around banking. If you don't have entities, you can't create a bank. So what does that look like? And in some cases, we find that actually the 1 and 2 employees are actually the most complex, and they're the ones that take the longest to solve for. Developing plans of your operating model, figuring out how you'll make it work, understand if this is a one-off, part of an ongoing strategy, and prepare to plan to address for it. Identify gaps. Do we need TSAs? How long are they? What partners can we leverage to bridge gaps? Set a solid infrastructure for the future. What do we want the end state to look like? Whether it be combined in-house, outsourced, how is that going to be delivered? How is that going to be supported? What report output, the technology component, are we integrating? Also, we need to deal with the duplicate resources or lack of them in most cases. If expertise goes with the acquiring company, what happens? So, need to be thinking about all the risk and try and mitigate it as much as possible. So, our guidance is TSA is generally, you're looking at ideally for a large organization 1 year. And if the deadline is one year, you need to be thinking about the process needs to start as soon as possible and based on priorities. If they're acquiring companies, the team or people will be working under a certain level of service. You need to understand what's in that TSA if you're not at the table early. They need to understand, that this will change, whether the changes are driven by the new vendor or by the company itself or the new company. The new company needs to drive an analysis of variabilities of parties involved. Otherwise, without consideration and clear setup of the model, whether that be local, external, project, the project can fail. And you need to clearly define amongst all participants of this transition project. And during transition planning, you need the right level of support. Support is key for you guys. We need to remember that this is done for business reasons. The M&A component is always done for business reasons. The only thing we can advise is get to the table early, and this will allow you to get an actual plan for resource management and a strategy. TSA is a must, and companies that have a good TSA will work this change better. If the company doesn't have one, it generally doesn't go as well as planned. You cannot rely on relationships to get through because it won't work. All parties provided in the TSA need to be part of that planning and the support to get you through that. So by doing the above, what are the benefits? Putting all the elements together, you can really help enable speed to pay, facilitating a transition, setting up new payroll org and operating model, driving efficiencies and onboarding of employees for payroll purposes, increasing engagement and buy-in for the new org, leveraging Workday's infrastructure, driving all employees to Workday platform, providing a common experience helps make a smoother transition, mitigating risk, ensuring compliance and driving better transparency and visibility by setting the right foundation for the global payroll from the beginning. Make sure all your bases are covered compliantly, especially if the deal involves new countries, as we mentioned a moment ago. Improving integrated reporting, analytic tools from the beginning, so you can really see how you're doing. Any payroll professionals need to assure compliance and business continuity. After that, payroll will have their own roadmap on how you're going to take it forward. And we need time, resources, budget to really optimize that function. You need to find a better partner. You need to find a good partner that you can work with.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for a great conversation. A reminder to the participants, if you've got questions, to put them into the chat and we'll get to them. But in the meantime, I'd like to ask our panelists to all come back on video as we have a couple of questions we'd like to discuss as a group as well.
Sure.
Perfect. So first, and we'll kind of go around the horn on this, maybe this time we'll start with Danielle, but like Neil and Tracy to answer as well. What have been some of the biggest risk factors you've encountered to successfully integrating people, process, and technology during a merger and acquisition or divestiture?
I think some of the biggest risk factors we've seen have been misaligned expectations between the two organizations. I think that understanding, what their goal was for day one versus day one and beyond has been a huge challenge. I think, the ones that have been really the biggest challenge has been those that have tried to make sure that everything was aligned on day one close. It is really hard to get all your systems lined up for day one close. But again, trying to understand, what the goals and objectives across the organizations are and making sure that there's alignment has been critical to success.
I would add to that, under promise, over deliver. So don't promise more than you can. I would say I would err on the other side. So yes, the road is going to be a little bit bumpy as we go through this process. However, here's what we've set up in place in order to help you through this process. Because if you tell them like everything's going to be perfect and it isn't, your inbox is going to blow up, and they're not going to be happy. And I would say the other thing too is, as I've gone through this process, is not making decisions quick enough. You don't have a lot of time to go through and do full due diligence. So sometimes you have to just kind of make decisions, keep going, keep going, keep going. If you have to adjust, then adjust. But waiting to have till the perfect answer arrives, you're not going to make your deadlines, and it's going to hold the whole process up.
Yeah, and getting to the table early, understanding what's in the TSA, because without really understanding what's in the TSA, really difficult to build a plan from.
Awesome. Great insights. So speaking of the TSA, in your experience, how and when is a TSA usually initiated? I know, Neil, you talked about, typically kind of a 1-year TSA or transition support agreement makes sense. At what point is that, that typically initiated, and what are some of the key items to be covered in it? And as well as some of the limitations. So Neil, maybe start off with you, and but Danielle and Tracy, of course, provide your additional comments as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we don't have control over the TSA. It's generally done for business reasons, but you can obviously have an input. And I think that's key. In an ideal world, a 12-month TSA would be fantastic. Most common we see is anywhere between 6 to 9 months generally. So to get to the table early is really important. So key items that you'd want in there: supporting data transfer, SLAs around response times, key personnel that's going to be involved, who's moving where, are they staying, where's the wealth of knowledge of the expertise of the payroll today. Flexibility, do you have budget in the TSA if you need additional resources? Because if you really think that you're going to do it with the team that you have today, it's going to be very challenging to try and carry out your day job whilst trying to manage a transformation or a harmonization, or just trying to stand up the new payrolls. So they're the key things that I'd be looking to have in the TSA from a payroll standpoint.
And Neil, I'm with you on the timeline. 12 months would always be wonderful, but shy of someone actually executing their activity in January, right? Typically, what we see is that the TSA covers either a tax year or a benefits cycle year. So, either the TSA runs through year end, and so things get complicated during open enrollment, for example, right? Where maybe the new benefits setup is going to take effect as part of open enrollments, but you continue TSA for existing benefits through year end. And same with payroll. I've seen payroll definitely, try to align with the tax years, which can be more complicated when we're talking about global organizations.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks for that. So another question related to that. So how do you best deal with things like audits and pay queries from before the TSA takes effect? So going back sort of almost pre-deal, and now you're in the midst of the deal, how do you manage some of those activities?
Usually there's something in the contract that states, if it's pre-merger. So usually it would be the, if it depends on sort of how the organization is structured. So if you're buying the entire company versus a piece of the company, I think the answer will change. So if you're buying the entire company, then all of the history would come with it. If you're only buying a piece of a company, then those inquiries would generally go back to the company that owned them at the time of when that happened.
Yeah, I agree.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks for that. So speaking of some of those as well, Tracy in particular, and then obviously again, Danielle and Neil, but any particular sort of insights into what's driving some of this market activity? I know I've certainly seen some statistics around increase in activity, both during this past year plus of the pandemic, but continuing on. Some reports I've read have shown that some of the industry analysts are expecting this activity to continue through this year and into 2022 and beyond. So any thoughts on what's driving some of that activity, and your thoughts around the extent to which it'll continue?
I think a lot of companies were hoarding cash during the pandemic. And so because they weren't sure how long it was going to last, what they were going to need to survive. And now that things have come a bit clearer, they've got this cash and they want something to do with it. There's still some bargains on the table too. So they're taking advantage of some companies that may have been weakened as a part of this, but are expected to rebound, would be my guess, my opinion.
Yeah, I think we're also seeing good interest in diversifying your client base. So whatever your market share is, trying to expand your market share outside of your core market to kind of provide you that buffer, so that depending on the ups and downs of the economy, you have opportunities to weather it a little differently based on different markets that people are being executed through.
Anything else that you've seen from your client base? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, similar for you, really. I mean, it's a multitude of things. It could be resource, could be technology, opportunity. I think to Tracy's point, people have been holding on to a lot of cash and they're seeing an opportunity, or organizations that, have, vast amounts of different service lines or product lines, deciding that they want to, focus on one core line. And deciding to divest a number of the different departments or service opportunities. So I think it's a multitude, but there's a lot of activity out there right now, that's for sure.
Gotcha. Awesome. Perfect. Melanie, are we seeing any questions come in from participants?
Yeah, we've just got time because we're just conscious of time. So what has been your experience with the IRS standard or alternate procedure in the same calendar year? Start wages over and provide 2 W-2s or convert wages to predecessor?
It really is dependent on the IRS legal entity structure. So from that perspective, so that you can only have one W-2 per legal entity. So if they're still going to be on the same legal entity, then they'll receive one W-2. If they have multiple legal entities, then they would receive a W-2 from each entity. So if they're on multiple companies.
Okay, thank you. So Catherine, obviously we're just over 5 o'clock now, so we've come to the end of today's session. Is there anything that you wanted to add before we finish up?
Oh, just a thanks to certainly all of our panelists, Tracy, Danielle, and Neil, obviously offering some great insights into the challenges associated with M&A and divestitures in the HCM payroll space. So really appreciate that. Thanks very much, Melanie, to you and GPA for hosting this as well. And certainly to all the attendees and participants for joining us today. And if there are any additional questions, we'll certainly try and answer them through email as best we can as well.
Thanks, Catherine. And just to let you guys know that if you wanted to see the webinar again, it will be available as it's being recorded, and also the slides. So they'll be made available on the website. So just to repeat what Catherine said, thank you so much to all the speakers today. Some fantastic insight there, and thank you for sharing your experience. And Catherine, thanks so much for moderating today.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and your evening, everyone.
See you later. Bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.